I'm Darren Morton.
I'm Simon Matthews. This is Lift,
the lifestyle medicine podcast where we dive into the science of health and well-being.
Hello again, Professor Morton. It's nice to see you here and nice to be back with you. We're going to be talking about something pretty fascinating today, I think. And I believe you have a story for us.
I do. This story captured my attention. Well, it's actually not just a story. It's a publication. So when I was a young physical education training teacher, I came across this article because, young males, maybe young females as well, I shouldn't be sexist there, but interested in gaining strength and muscularity. And I found this article. It's published in 1961 and in the Journal of Applied Physiology. So this is a high-powered journal. And it was all the researchers had examined factors that contribute to the production of human strength. And this was, I should say, the good old days before ethics committees, when you could get people to do all sorts of things. No, I don't mean good old days. I know that ethics serve a very valuable role. Yeah, that's right. Ethics committees are sometimes arduous, but they play an important function, of course. But what they'd done is they'd got people to do a whole range of different things. So they had these people that were conditioned, they were already good at lifting weights, and then they got them to do a range of different phenomena. For example, they got them to ki-eye, like yell. I don't know if you've done martial arts, but I did that for many years. Yeah. And we would yell, that yell, and they were interested to see, does that increase force production? And of course, we see that, the Olympic lifters that you do that. Then they had people yell at them. so that was another arm of the trial. But then they got into the fun stuff. So, for example, they fed them amphetamines. So they gave them speed to see what actually happened to that amount, whether they could produce more force. And that was interesting in itself. But one of the trials greatly intrigued me because what they did is they hypnotized people. And they were interested to see if under suggestion, these people could produce more strength. What was interesting is there's this little line in the study, in the discussion section, that said one particular subject in the study was quite skeptical about this whole hypnosis thing. And so he'd actually, he said, give me some proof. If you can hypnotize me, then give me some proof that you've done it. And so what they did is during the, once again, pre-ethics, but he did actually go under suggestion. And under suggestion, they held up an ordinary pen and they said, this is a red hot iron. And they touched him on the back of the hand with that pen. And he screamed, which, okay, well, he was under suggestion. The psychology there would make sense. However, within an hour, he develops a wound on the back of his hand that takes over a week to heal. And I remember seeing this and I just went, wow, because I think that often we understand that, okay, screaming, thinking that I've just been burnt, that's a psychological thing. But what this demonstrated is this connection between, what you think, your expectations and what you believe can have a profound effect on your physiology and your physical outcomes. And there's this thing that we're going to talk about today called the placebo effect, which really speaks to this, doesn't it? This role that expectation, that belief about a particular thing can have on a whole host of different symptoms and even healings within our body. So Simon, you're a psychologist. What can you tell us about this placebo effect?
Well, one of the things that I've always been aware of as a psychologist is the role of placebo in the treatment relationship, say between a psychologist and client, or a physician and patient, or a psychiatrist and patient, any of those sorts of treatment relationships. And in fact, there's a body of research called the common factors research, and you and I have spoken about this before. The common factors research goes back many decades now, and essentially the same results have been replicated time after time. The common factors research originally sought to answer a particular question in treatment. So if you go right back to the very beginning of psychiatry and psychology, psychiatry emerged towards the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, with psychiatrists like Freud and Jacques Lacan and so on. And those people were medical practitioners, and really, I mean, there wasn't a discipline of psychiatry at the time. They just started
Yeah.
doing this sort of work. In the early 20th century, we started seeing behaviourism. So people like B.F. Skinner and so on, and behaviourism started to emerge as a way of endeavouring to explain human behaviour, and then we added cognition to that, and so on. And this is in the early to mid 20th century, and all through this time, there are more and more and more methodologies and approaches to psychological treatment and psychological engagement appearing. Until we get to the 1970s, and there's this whole raft of different approaches to family therapy. In the 1980s, there's more. Famously, an Australian was really a driving force behind what we now call narrative therapy and narrative family therapy. We literally now have thousands of different therapeutic approaches and modalities. So the common factors research thought originally to answer the question, well, which one of these works best? And through the course of that research, 4 common factors were identified. The most powerful factor in any therapeutic engagement is actually the resources that the client or patient has themselves, or the resources that they can develop. Now this is not the idea that we have everything within us right now that we need to engage in our own healing, but it is the idea that we are resourceful people and we can harness resources in novel ways to address challenges in our lives, and we can develop new ways of doing things. So that's the biggest factor. Second biggest factor is the connection or the relationship between the practitioner and the patient. So what we call now the therapeutic alliance. The third factor is the actual modality that you use. In other words, you need to have some skill or proficiency at something or at some things. A little like a builder. A builder needs to have a range of tools and needs to be able to use them, but the tools themselves aren't what gets the job done best. And then the fourth factor, the final factor, is the idea of the hope that's generated for the person, or in our context, what we're calling the placebo effect. And in the common factors research, the placebo effect accounts for about 15% of the positive outcomes that we observe in therapy. So it's not the most significant factor, but it's significant enough for me that I would ask, is it ethical to ignore it? If something can account for 15% of an outcome for someone, is it ethical for me just to skip right over that, or should I really be paying attention to it? And the side of the fence that I've fallen on, of course, is I should be paying attention to it.
Yeah, and I think obviously this is in the context of a sort of psychological intervention therapy.
Yeah.
And actually, there's a great quote in some of the articles I was reading in preparation for this, and one of them actually said that in the context of clinical trials, we need to be minimising the placebo effect to see what the true effect of the intervention is.
What the true
but
effect,
in clinical, but in clinical settings, we need to be optimising and maximising the influence of the placebo effect.
Yeah.
What's interesting though, you talk about that second common factor was that therapeutic alliance, that relationship, and there's actually evidence that we know about probably sort of 60 to 70% of physicians admit to actually providing placebo to their patients, for one. But what we do know is that some physicians seem to be better at eliciting a placebo effect. And when they've drilled down on what seems to be the common factor there, is it's once again it's that alliance. It's whether the the patient feels that they can trust the person,
Yeah.
and whether they believe them or not.
Yeah.
And so once again, it
Yeah.
speaks to that importance of belief, and
Yeah.
expectation. It's incredibly
And
incredibly powerful.
we talk about the common factors. I mean, there are in this research that we've been talking about, there are 4 common factors. But as you've just alluded to, they're not siloed from each other. There's an
Yeah.
interactional effect. And for example, if I were to, well, let's demonstrate this right now. If I were to say to you right now, right here in my shirt pocket, I have a pill that I can give you that will enable you to live to the age of 250 years. Do you
Wow.
feel
Give
more
it to me
hopeful?
now.
but but do you honestly and seriously think that
No.
this is going to make any difference? Okay, all right. Um, let's get rid of that one. This time I'm going to reach into my other pocket, and here I have a small pill that I can give you to take daily, which in the presence of exercise will support you to get about a 5 to 10% increase in strength over and above what you would get if you just did the exercise. What are you thinking now?
Yeah, that sounds. I like the idea of the 10% more than 5%, but yeah, that sounds
Okay.
entirely plausible,
But
and
But it
I
sounds a
think I
little
could
more
buy into
believable
it.
to you, doesn't it? Yeah, yeah.
Yes,
And so
yeah,
here's one of the really interesting things about placebo, that it
mm,
needs to be believable to us.
yes,
If it's totally unbelievable, I mean, the idea of living to the age of 250 years, it just seems ridiculous. So
mm.
it's very, very hard for the placebo effect to work in that circumstance. But when the context is believable,
Mm.
seems to make a difference.
And it's interesting, the studies in this space showing there are things you can do to increase the believability of it. And one of them is that the more complex and comprehensive the placebo is, the more likely it is to have the effect that have a placebo effect. So, for example, we know that injections work better than pills because it's more
Mm.
invasive, it looks more medical, it's more official. Surely, injecting something is going to be better than taking a pill. But if you have to take a pill, there's some really interesting research on this as well. For example, we know that bigger pills work better than smaller pills because big is always better, clearly. But also, if you have a pill that is branded, like a branded pill, that looks official now, doesn't it? Like that, this is the
Yeah.
real deal. But also the color of the pill can make an influence. And what's been quite interesting about this, it depends on the circumstance there. So if you're, for example, wanting a sedative, you don't want it to be bright pink. A blue
Yeah.
sedative, placebo pill,
A
works more
blue, or
effectively than a
maybe even
pink.
white. Yeah.
White might, yeah, I
Yeah.
don't know. Well, I know that blue seems to
Wow.
be really good because it
And,
looks relaxing.
and my guess here is that if you want to evoke the idea of some powerful positive change, something to do with energy or activity, then a yellow or a red coloured pill is going to work better than a blue coloured pill.
This is sounding very Matrix now, isn't it? Which pill will
Yeah,
it
yeah,
be?
yeah,
The red pill or
yeah.
the blue pill?
So
Yeah.
this is fascinating because I think it speaks in so many ways to what goes on normally inside our minds. Anyway, the first part of it is our brains are essentially sense making devices. Um, they seek to make sense of the world around us so that we can then take actions that are in our own best interests. So a human brain is always on the lookout for something that seems to make sense. This is why we see patterns where there are no patterns. For example, people might buy a lottery ticket and win 3 weeks in a row, and then believe that they're on a winning streak because this pattern seems to be emerging. When I go to this agency at this day on this time and I spend this much money, I win. So it's a kind of the creation of ultimately a false belief, seeing a pattern that just isn't there. But that's what our brains do. That's why sometimes we think we recognise someone in a crowd. Because our brains are scanning all the time, looking for something that might be familiar to us, something that we might be able to make sense of. So, if we're presented with, with a complex and plausible mechanism for the operation of a placebo, a human brain is likely to go, yeah, makes sense to me. Let's do it.
LIFT is supported by the LIFT Project, an educational adventure where you learn science-based ways to lift your mood and your life. The LIFT Project is lifting lives around the globe, in healthcare settings, workplaces, schools, universities and communities. To find out more, visit theliftproject.global.
I actually just watched a Netflix series with my eldest son called Quarterback. And it was really interesting to watch the story of the quarterbacks and what they do in preparation for a game. And obviously, being, in the right sort of arousal level, psychologically prepared for the performance. And I was interested to see how many of them have these rituals that they follow, just like you've described. I walk over to that goalpost and then I have a prayer, and then I walk over here and I throw the ball 3 times, and then I make sure that I don't step on any lines as I'm walking back to my home turf. It's interesting that, they're almost these rituals. It's almost like a placebo because, and by definition, a placebo is an activity that we do or an intervention that we implement that has no sort of plausible reason why it should influence the outcome, other than it affects us psychologically in some kind of a way.
Yeah.
But what is also interesting, and I'm interested in your reflections on this, is that I noticed there are some studies that show that some people are more susceptible to placebo effects than others. So, for example, optimists do seem to be more likely to benefit from a placebo. Does that surprise you as a psychologist?
It doesn't surprise me, and in some ways, I think it comes back to the discussion we were having just a little earlier about suggestibility. We know that some people are more suggestible than others. This is why, if you've ever been to one of those stage hypnosis shows, after dinner, a bunch of people in a big room, the hypnotist up the front calls for some volunteers, and 50 people rush the stage to volunteer, and then the hypnotist goes along and does a really simple kind of test to see how suggestible people are, and he might line them up in a row, touch them, say something to them, and straight away the hypnotist discards a number of people and sends them back to the crowd.
Yes.
What they're doing there is looking for the most suggestible people, the people who are going to most easily kind of conform to what they're doing. So there's a couple of things going on here. The first is that the people who volunteer are naturally gregarious and outgoing and quite happy to do stupid things on stage. They're not going to feel self-conscious about that. So there's a self-selection process there. And then there's the selection by the hypnotist to really identify the high level of suggestibility which is desirable here. So we do know that those levels of suggestibility exist. In fact, I'll tell you a fascinating story about this from my early days as a psychologist. I had a client, a young man. He was a little bit older than me at the time, and his father had passed away several years before in very, very tragic circumstances. And this man had been very close to his father growing up, and in the final weeks of his father's life, he'd essentially, watched him waste away and then pass away in terrible pain. And he was really, really troubled by these memories and still quite grief-stricken about this whole process. And I met with him, a few times, and he seemed really, really stuck in this. And I had a colleague who in fact is still a very dear friend, who had trained in clinical and therapeutic hypnosis. And I spoke to him about this one day and asked him his opinion, and he said, "Well, he said, I think there's a good chance that hypnosis may be useful here." So I spoke to my client. We arranged a meeting between the three of us. He was agreeable to moving in that way. So the three of us scheduled a time, and my friend Michael performed a hypnotic induction for this man. And then once he was in this state of hypnosis, proceeded to make to him a number of suggestions about recalling memories of the strength of his father, the vigour of his father, the build of his father, and so on. And we followed up with him, first of all, a week later, and then about 2 weeks later, and then about a month later. And his view, his memories of his father and his sense of himself in relation to his father had undergone a dramatic shift as a result of that. He was now no longer troubled by those distressing memories that he had. They were still there. It wasn't like he'd forgotten them. He could recall them. But the things that immediately came to mind for him were much more pleasurable memories of his life as a child with his father, his love for his father's love for him, and so on. That absolutely knocked my socks off at the time. That the idea that the human mind was malleable enough in that way that we could in a sense create a different emphasis for ourselves on what matters. And for me, the really important thing was that there was no erasing of any experience. There was no implanting of a false or untrue memory. There was no pretense that what had happened hadn't happened. All of those things were still there for him. Yet the suggestibility in him meant that he was ultimately able to adopt a different perspective for himself. It was incredible.
Which was helpful to him, clearly, and that's
very
that's
helpful.
amazing.
Yeah.
So my question to you is, I'm reflecting here. Martin Seligman has written quite a lot on this, and looking at the use of, for example, antidepressant medication for people with depression, which he said, if you look at the consensus of what the data suggests, probably about 65% therapeutic success rate, if you wanted to call it successful in terms of relief rate, which is fantastic. He said that, and then he notes that in most cases, there's about a 45 to 55% improvement rate amongst people taking a placebo, a known placebo. And then he actually even makes the comment that within about 50% of the studies that have been used to approve the medications by the FDA, in about 50% of them, there was actually no difference between placebo arms and the treatment arms. So, with that sort of reflection, is it a good thing? Should we be promoting the placebo effect? Should it be something that we embrace more? Or, I think there's sometimes this tension there. People think that it's not real, and that's an interesting comment in its own right. What is real? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, for a start, I think it's very real because we can observe an outcome as a result. So there's absolutely something very real about it. Look, there are some fascinating ethical questions here. You've already mentioned one of them, which is the idea that when we're trialing something active, then we really ought to be minimising the impact of any placebo effect, because we really want to understand just how powerful this new active agent is. That said, we know that the placebo effect is a thing. So once that active agent is being used, then it makes no sense to keep trying to minimise the placebo effect. That's part of it.
Yes.
The second thing to be aware of, I think, is that if you have diabetes or you have hypertension or something like that, I can't give you any placebo that's going to change that. I can't placebo you out of diabetes or something like that. So the placebo effect seems to, at least in the context we're talking about, seems to be most effective when we're talking about things like depression, like insomnia, and even pain, the experience of pain. So these are all highly kind of subjective experiences which seem to lend themselves to the influence of a placebo. So
Mm.
that's part of it. I think there are some ethical questions that we
Mm.
need to address carefully. I
Actually,
think
before you go
I
on,
think yeah
I'll just make one comment on that. It's interesting in the clinical trial. We want to tease out, want to minimise that placebo effect because we want to know what the effect of the actual compound or
mm,
concoction or intervention that we're trialing. I wonder to what extent that matters. If like, for example, nutrition, one of my sort of
yeah
pet peeves with
yeah
nutrition research is that often we'll learn that blueberries are great for us, but then what the researchers want to know is, well, what is it in blueberries that's great for us? And the truth is, there's probably a million or thousands of things in blueberries that are great for us, and it's the symbiotic connections between
yeah
them all
yeah
that actually come together to have that effect. But anyway, yeah, I get from a pure science point of view, trying to isolate the effect of each component is important. But at the end of the day, if it works ethically, is that a good thing?
yeah yeah. Well, I'm kind of on the same page as you here, that if something works and we can demonstrate it works with little to no ill and its working seems to be widespread, yeah, then absolutely go for it.
It's
At the same time,
mm,
we can't deny the human quest for wanting to
yes,
understand, because of course if we can deconstruct something and we can understand
mm,
the individual components, then there's an opportunity to consider in what ways we may be able to apply this knowledge over there, um, and
yes,
reconstruct that in a different way. So we, I think we shouldn't look past that. And at the same time, absolutely, there are symbiotic effects. We often go looking for a single reason or single explanation for something, and the truth is there is almost never a single explanation for something.
mm,
Um,
mm,
there are always complex, interwoven and interacting um, um, forces or influences behind particular outcomes that we
mm,
see. And this of course is one of the this is generally one of the one of the challenges of research, isn't it? Of all research,
mm,
really trying to remove confounding effects so that we can kind of understand what might be going on here. So
yeah. And
that's another dimension, I think, to the placebo research and placebo impact.
mm. Now tell me, before we wrap it up, I've got to ask you a question because you sort of alluded to it and you said that perhaps as long as things aren't doing harm. And we know that the placebo effect has
Mm,
almost an evil twin, doesn't it?
yeah.
This
The
nocebo
Nocebo
effect.
effect.
Tell
Yeah.
us a little bit about that.
Well, the nocebo effect is the idea that um, we form the view that something might harm us, and we
Mm,
seem to experience a harm as a result of that. And
mm,
again, the nocebo effect seems to be limited. So, for example, if I believe that if I form the belief that eating a particular food is going to cause me to develop high blood pressure or unless that food itself does that, then that outcome is highly unlikely, because I don't think that I have that level of influence. But if I form the belief that a particular activity or a particular action or a particular experience is going to interfere with my sleep, then that may well magnify any impact of insomnia that I'm currently having. So, for example, I may for some reason develop a dietary pattern of deciding that I want to snack on carrots late in the evening, and then I try to go to sleep, and coincidentally, I experience disturbed sleep. As far as I know, you might know better, but as far as I know, there's no link between carrots and insomnia. But I may well form the belief that these carrots are causing me to experience poor sleep. And of course, that's going to then magnify within me the effect of that, because as soon as I pick up a carrot, or as soon as I see a carrot after 9 o'clock at night, once I'm in this state, then I'm going to look at a carrot. I'm going to groan. I'm going to start getting physiologically activated about the possible impact of that, and so on. And it's pretty easy to see how all of that is going to lead to me having disturbed sleep.
And certainly there are studies showing that when people are told this pain relief medication lasts about 3 hours, well, about 3 hours later, there seems to be this exponential increase in their experience of pain. And I actually, to get a little bit personal, my father developed prostate cancer, and I went to the urologist with him and sat down, and when they gave the report, and they used the word, it was aggressive cancer, and that was the one word my father remembered from that particular meeting. And he asked one question in the meeting, and that was, how long do I have to live? And I remember, and maybe people would differ in their view of this to me, but the doctor had the audacity to give him a number. And I remember he said 5 to 8 years. Now, that was 22 years ago. But I do remember walking out and saying to Dad, you know what, just wipe that number from your head. You don't want to create an expectation around that, because I know the power of the placebo to play into this. Simon,
and to go back to our earlier. Well, let's just go back to our earlier conversation first, and speaking again of the ethics of all of this. It's a great example of the treatment alliance and the interaction with that sort of effect, and the power of a physician using a word like aggressive disease to a patient. At least for, look, I guess we need to strike a balance between being honest with people and being clear with people, so that people can make choices. At the same time, we need to recognise the power of things like words, the power of our own influence, the power of suggestions that we make to pretty dramatically shape someone's experience of their health, themselves, and their lives. So this is one of the really deeply embedded, I think, questions around placebo. That there is I don't think there's a clear answer to this, but there is the possibility of ongoing self-reflection and ongoing self-examination to consider the language that we use, the connections that we make, the words that we use, the suggestions that we make, and thinking from the patient or the client perspective, what might be the impact over there.
Yeah. I think that's really powerful because we do become what we believe. Belief plays a really powerful role. I remember, just to wrap up, I remember when I was in a different area of research, there was a particular researcher that I greatly admired. His name was Jack Sinclair. He was a professor of physiology from New Zealand. And he said this comment one time that always stuck with me, because he was a physiologist. He was particularly interested in elite, performance, exercise performance. He was quite an athlete in his own right. And he was talking about who wins, and we've got the Olympics coming up shortly, so maybe this is a pertinent question. He said, who is it that wins? And he says, at the end of the day, it boils down to the great physiological unknown. He said, it's the psyche. And he said this statement, he goes, the one who wins is the one who expects to win. And I always think of that, that it's the power of expectancy and the power of belief. And I think really that, what we see, the evidence for this placebo effect, which, if used in the right ways, can be a great adjunct to therapy. It just speaks to that importance of, how, what we believe and what we expect. And then as healthcare providers, how we can actually foster that in positive and useful ways.
Yeah. I mean, in lifestyle medicine, I think that's particularly important. So, for example, one of the things one of the elements I think that can really have a shaping influence for patients is to be able to observe in their own physicians and treatment providers the things that are being spoken about. So these can also, and this is a different topic, but these can also operate at the level of nudges, which we've talked about before. The idea of an environmental cue that invites a person to act in a particular way. So if a physician is talking to a patient about the benefit of movement and activity, and they have in their office, a pair of their own running shoes up against the wall that they obviously strap on and go walking each lunchtime. If they have some certificates or medallions from running events or other events adorning their office, all of those things together, I think can provide these subtle cues and suggestions to a patient of the value of this particular activity. And this is where nudge, placebo, therapeutic alliance all start to, I think, get into the mix together, and it does become a little difficult to tease out exactly what's going on. But what we can say, I think, with confidence, is that it's better that those cues are there than not there.
Absolutely. I told before we recorded this, I said to my wife, "Are we going to record a podcast on the placebo effect?" And she said, "Oh, that's interesting." And then her comment was, "You know what? If I can't get the best medication, give me the best placebo." So I wish for you, Simon, the best placebo. I hope that it's highly therapeutic. Hey, thanks for the discussion. It's been a lot of fun.
Absolutely. Always is. And I hope your wife listens to this and feels better afterwards.
I'm sure she will.
Lift is presented by Simon Matthews and Darren Morton. It's sponsored by the Lift Project and supported by Avondale University. Music provided by Placebo. If you have a question or a topic you would like to hear more about, send us an email to podcast@theliftproject.global. The Lift Project. Lift your mood, lift your life.